Yeah, port cities and cities of Asia, port cities of Asia is something that I have taught about and I've written about. So I thought it's actually good to be able to share a little bit. I feel Singapore makes a great case study because it is a port city and it was a port city of empire. So I think it's just sort of keeping it in that perspective. Some very basic ideas to start with to address some of Lloyd's initial comments. When I talk about port cities, I always talk about a city that is a bridge between land and sea. So that idea of a union between land and sea. So port cities, the port is a very economic function in some ways, but it gives the city a very distinctly maritime feel or maritime characteristics. So this is one way of thinking about it. When you examine port cities, perhaps one of the things that you consider is with port cities tend to be outward looking. They are quite often connected to other port cities. So the relationship is two ways. In one case, it is the port to the maritime, the port city to its maritime connections, right? So in that sense, it looks towards the waters and to other ports. So it's not so much about national histories as it is, say, histories of networks and maritime connections. The other connection that a port city has is to its hinterland. So to the land immediately around the port, or in the case of Singapore, a bit broader than that because it's not just the Malay Peninsula. Right? So there are two different ways you can think about the connections, but scholars that have examined port cities of Asia would tend to say, or port cities in general, you cannot forget the maritime. And what the maritime does, if you are examining port cities, is it opens up new possibilities in terms of the types of histories that you could be writing or researching. So I would say that this is why I feel that there's a value in looking at the port city and seeing it as a distinct type. And recognizing that port cities are hubs. I would call them hubs. Essentially, they're a place where you have this facilitation of the flow of people, goods, and ideas. And this is something that has occurred over centuries, right? So port cities are quite often meeting places of cultures. It's where some of the big exchanges take place, whether it's religious influences, commercial products, but also migration is quite often the port city is like the entry point or that first point of contact. So that's just my general thinking of port cities. I would say what I find exciting about looking at port cities is the idea of moving beyond a national history. So to look to the water means you're no longer necessarily because if you think about it, as scholars and just in everyday life, we tend to be fairly land oriented. So we tend to think about the land. If you think about the maritime, you are actually bridging quite vast regions. You are bridging different networks. You can move beyond very set structures of the nation state and begin to talk about ports as part of networks, for instance. So you can see connections between, say, the Indian Ocean world, Southeast Asia, and East Asia through the port cities. Right? So it just sort of, I wouldn't say it flips on its head, but it presents a different way of thinking about history. If you tilt to the maritime, the ocean becomes the point of connection. Traditionally, if we think about the way that history has been written, the ocean is usually the boundary. So it forms a boundary or an obstacle. If you think about it in terms of maritime history, the ocean becomes the conduit or the means of finding connections. Right, so that's the way I'm just sort of framing my ideas. Whether you agree or not, that is it's something that can be up for debate, definitely. But thinking about maritime history, this is something that scholars such as Broza, Macpherson, and Reeves, who are some of the first scholars to really look at maritime history and port cities, they try and make this case that to understand a place like Singapore, you need to put the port back into the city. So you need to understand the maritime and you need to think about the type of connections it has. Once you do that, you better understand the context of Singapore and its development. Right, so that's my general comments.